I used to tell myself it was about sleep. That recording rain was a comfort, a kind of white curtain to pull down when thoughts got too loud. People collect sounds like that, packaging them as calm. But when I began leaving a mic by the window, it wasn't comfort I was chasing. It was something else. Something hiding beneath the smallest things first. A faint pulse under the hiss and patter. Low, regular. I thought it was nothing. Maybe the mic preamp, maybe a distant truck on wet asphalt. But the more I listened, the less I believed that. It had formed too clean, too steady. I almost convinced myself I was just tired. Yet fatigue doesn't draw neat lines across spectra. I keep a portable mixer at my desk, nothing fancy. Plastic casing rubbed smooth at the edges, knobs stiff from long use. I pushed the gain, balanced out the rainfall, and played the loop. There it was again, hum-hushed under the storm-like breath through walls. Exactly 1 second apart. Not faster, not slower. Like a metronome, but colder. This was the first night I knew I couldn't dismiss it. Rain can be chaotic, unpredictable. This pattern wasn't that. I kept watching the meter lights on my mixer. With each pulse, a green flick. My ears picked rhythm, and my eyes confirmed it in hardware. Equipment doesn't care about imagination. Something was imprinted there. I searched back through what I knew. Radio bands once buzzing with chatter. Military tests layered into weather reports. My brother spoke of these things before he disappeared. Half jokes about Cold War leftovers. Frequencies that wander, waiting. At the time I laughed. Now years later, staring at my own recordings, I don't laugh at all. I found a stack of FCC charts online. Public, but dusty. Old PDFs that no one bothers scrolling past page 10. I scanned with my finger, tracing shaded regions, interference bands noted in yellow. And there in the 30 to 40 megahertz pocket a footnote. Variable storm interference. Document closed with no conclusion. Filed, set aside. Almost like what I heard. Rain pounded that night. I sat inches from the glass, mic aimed out into the open dark. A downpour erased clear shapes, leaving only blur and shadow. Perfect cover. But through the headphones, no blur. Only the pulse, steady. It wasn't flattened by wind or swallowed by thunder. It cut through as if insulated, protected inside the noise. I can't explain the feeling. My body didn't hear, it reacted. Shoulders tight, heartbeat sinking without permission. I tried to relax, but my bones betrayed me. Captured by a pattern I couldn't shake, like being tapped on the same spot of skin every second, until nerves surrender. Comfort had been replaced by a strange kind of command. I considered dismissing it still. Bad wiring, coincidence, brain trick. But I swapped cables, switched outlets, and even dragged the whole thing into the kitchen. Different outlet, same pulse beneath the rainfall. My gear was not broken, and that scared me more than the possibility it was. Because if the equipment was fine, then something outside had forced itself, and by dawn, I had a collage of loops. Some quiet, some clearer. Always the pulse marking time behind storm sound. I noted times, dates, weather conditions. And the smaller detail, it only surfaced when rain punched hard enough to mask the city hum. As though the storm was camouflage for something else pushing through. I didn't tell anyone that first night. Who do you explain it to? A hum, a pulse, a nothing that sounds like structure. To most ears, it's bedtime filler. But to me it had teeth. Information wears disguises, sometimes as chatter, sometimes as silence, and sometimes as rain. This felt deliberate, whether by human hand or something harder to name. At 3 in the morning, when the downpour was thickest, headphones pressed to my skull, I caught myself whispering back. Not words, just breath measured with the beat, as though answering. A reflex I regretted immediately. Because in answering, even thoughtlessly, I had admitted belief. The signal existed. It was active, and I was locked to it now. By the next morning, daylight softened things. I replayed the files on cheap speakers, coffee rattling at hand. Sun poured in, and for a second, I wanted to laugh at myself again. The hum felt weaker then, less sharp. Maybe I had overbuilt the fear. But patterns care little for light. They keep their place regardless. That unnerves me more than any trick of dark. The mixer still sat warm from overuse. Reminders scattered. Lined notebook half filled with timing notches, caffeine stains curling margins. I stared at the blinking cursor of a search bar, hovering over phrases like unexplained signal and rain static. Half ashamed, half hungry. Because what begins as curiosity doesn't end at curiosity. It ends at pursuit. I realized, grinding hands into my eyes, that I had set out for a simple recording habit, and instead stepped into something else. Something waiting to be heard. When I scrolled back one last time through FCC bands, eyes bleary, I noticed a blank gap left between charts, unmarked, unassigned. Not by accident. Someone decided not to annotate those ranges. The pulse belonged to that silence. Hidden in plain sight, inside paperwork older than me. Someone, long before these recordings, had typed lines around its existence and then drawn curtains over it. Maybe the rain let it through. Maybe the rain was always its door. Whatever the case, I had opened it wider by listening. I set my jaw on one thought. This isn't faulty gear. This isn't imagination. It is present. It is deliberate. And for reasons I don't yet understand, it has chosen me to notice. I closed the mixer with a snap. Outside, the rain had thinned. Yet in my ears, the pulse refused to fade. I carried the recorder from room to room that next night, hoping to prove what part of me still doubted. In the kitchen, by the fridge, under fluorescent buzz, there it was, faint but constant. Moved to the bedroom near an open vent, and still the steady hum cut beneath the rainfall. I even pressed the mic against the wall, half convinced it might be wiring or a neighbor's appliance. Nothing changed. The pulse traveled with me, unshaken by walls or outlets. It was no longer confined to one space. It lived inside the storm itself. I set the portable spectrum analyzer on the desk, screen glowing shallow blue in the half-dark. When the storm intensified, the band leapt up like a flare. A spike clung sharp and narrow, nothing my little electret mic should ever be able to register. I traced it in disbelief, a perfect tower pushing through the noise floor. Rain usually muddies signals. This sharpened them. I stared until eyes ached. Improvised gear doesn't make spikes this clean. Something else was riding shotgun on the weather. I decided not to trust only myself, not again. That afternoon, through half-remembered contacts, I reached out to the old technician I once met, a man who spoke more easily about forgotten circuits than his own past. Over the phone, his voice carried more static than signal, but I told him what I'd found. He grew quiet when I sent him the sample file. His only response chilled me. That's no household feedback. Reminds me of how jammers used to cut frequencies to ribbons. Only this one isn't jamming. It's holding steady. He paused, then muttered, almost to himself. You don't want to chase ghosts of Cold War spectrum, kid. That business left stains. When evening came and the storm returned, I sat alone again. Simple room, tangled wires, the smell of damp air moving through cracked windows. I clipped the hum from hours of tape, stripped away rainfall like peeling cloth off a hidden shape. Left with nothing but the baritone, I looped it into repetition. Fighting exhaustion, I slipped headphones over my ears. The hum became more than sound. It landed behind my eyes, an ache that built with each cycle. My temples pulsed in sync. The longer I listened, the heavier the pressure grew, until I had to grab the arm of my chair to remind myself where I was. It wasn't loud, just invasive. Not sound carried to the ear, but sound pressing straight into the body as if air itself had become charged. Each repetition dug a little deeper, making my scalp prickle and throat tighten. Sweat tickled its way down my jaw despite the room being cool. The loop trapped me in its rhythm, a circle I couldn't easily cut free from. I pulled the headphones off, but the pressure lingered. That was the worst part. Silence wasn't silence anymore. The sensation outlived the tape. Like footprints in soil, something remained impressed inside. The rain outside thickened, thrashing the glass. The background roar grew greater, masking birds, muffling traffic, flattening the rest of the city. And still the recording stayed level. It didn't care how loud the weather grew. It did not bend or blur. Strength held constant against the storm, as if borrowing its weight, pulling itself taller with every drop landing on roofs and concrete. Compelled, I leaned closer, whispered aloud though no one could hear me. Are you hiding behind the storm or using it? I almost laughed at how mad that sounded. Talking to an interference pattern. Yet the spike answered by persisting, unwavering, more convincing than words. I scribbled notes in margin-smeared paper, hands shaking. Charted timestamps, peak intensities, rainfall measures from the Weather Service, all aligning with the bloom. None of this was random. An ordinary mic registering extraordinary stability in the middle of chaos. I'd read somewhere that control isn't loud. It's consistent. That's what this was. Control inside noise. The old technician's warning returned like an echo. Some signals weren't meant just to be heard. They were built to do something else. The feeling of weight behind my eyes convinced me he was right. Whatever this was, it wasn't communication in the friendly sense. It was presence. I debated calling him back, pressing harder for details about jammers and tests. But I could still hear tension in his pause, like he'd already said more than he wanted. Information closes doors as often as it opens them. I suspected he wouldn't answer a second time. Alone in the room, equipment buzzing faintly, I made myself a promise. If storms don't mask the signal but empower it, then following storms might reveal more. I would track it. I'd trace its pattern across weather maps. Link its spikes to rainfall charts, to archived sky conditions, to forgotten towers. Even if that path led deeper into silence and fear than I was ready for. The rain slammed harder, steady rhythms cutting the night into equal parts. Thunder rolled low and distant, but I barely registered it. All I could hear was the pulse pressed into my head, stubborn and patient, riding through water on steel rooftops. Fear rose hot as I stared at the spectrum spike, frozen in glassy blue. It wasn't faint anymore. It was a presence, anchoring itself to every drop hitting the earth. And in that moment, as the storm howled against the house, I couldn't escape the thought, maybe the storms aren't camouflage at all. Maybe they are the doorway left open wide storms, not as cover, but as strength. I gripped the desk, steadying my breath, knowing this was my path now. Whether chosen or forced, I had agreed to follow wherever it led. 3 nights of storms gave me 3 nights of data. I lined the spikes up, each bloom marking its place like a heartbeat stamped into paper. I noticed it first by accident, staring at the marks till dawn. Every new rise fell exactly 3 minutes after the last. Precise enough to be mechanical. No weather curve flows like that. Rain runs wild, lightning strays, gusts shift. This was locked rhythm. So I charted it, line after line. My desk vanished under grids that looked more like maps than audio logs. At first it seemed pointless scrawl, but then I traced the intersections. The pattern didn't just repeat in time, it spread across frequency bands. Like plotting X and Y, I ran calculations, crude but clear enough. Where the points converged hinted at numbers, and those numbers resembled coordinates. My stomach turned as I checked them. Not random at all. A real location. Not miles away in another country, just outside a small town I half remembered driving past years ago. heading west into Ohio farmland. A wide circle around nothing much. Except the chart's heart landed on an old communications tower ground I'd heard was decommissioned decades back. The idea struck me harder than thunder. Coordinates written into rain hums. Deliberate or accident? Both answers terrified me. I couldn't ignore it. To not chase would be to admit fear, and fear had teeth that only grow when restrained. So I pulled open my old duffel, set the recorder inside, and packed the handheld scanner a friend once handed down to me. Obsolete, clunky, but with a whip antenna that still found signals rawer than polished modern gear. I'd need that rawness now. Driving out, the city bled behind into black highways. Signposts blurred past like unread warnings. Every mile deepened the secret I carried. I kept glancing at the passenger seat where the recorder case lay. It felt too heavy for its size, like it knew we were heading to its origin. My own chest grew heavy with it. Secrets add weight. Walking around with this knowledge was like smuggling a stone no one else should ever see. The storm followed me. Clouds rolled dense above the cornfields, spitting first drops onto the windshield in soft patterns that built steadily, then dropped hard and jagged. Wipers cut their metronome arcs, while outside the horizon turned into walls of gray. I left the interstate for state routes, then county roads half-lined with forgotten barns and machinery rusted to skeletons. No one watched. Just fields bending under rain and wind dot. The coordinates led me to a clearing lined with warped fencing. I parked under a leaning pole and stepped out. At first it just looked like open mud, tufts of weeds, puddles swallowing the ground. But walking further showed what remained metal teeth rising from soil, footings of a tower foundation left to collapse. No steel ribs, no mast-stretching sky, only the stubs planted like gravestones. The tower had lived here once, then died and been left unburied. Yet coordinates don't lead to ghosts by mistake. I powered the handheld scanner, adjusting its dial against the rainfall's hiss. It started faint, baseline static matched by drops hitting corn leaves beyond me. Then the sweep caught. The tone ripped up like an alarm, half animal, half machine. The scanner howled so sharp I had to hold it away from my chest, its bar flicking wildly into red. Even as the rain lashed louder, the signal sat like bone behind the noise, immovable, resolute. Each sweep, the scanner cried again, as if tuned into a distress call, stripped of words. No voice, no message. Just urgency expressed in raw bandwidth, repeating without end. My throat caught as I thought of ship radios, pilots forced down, miners calling through rock. Except here, there were no victims in sight. Only empty field, only tower ruins. A distress with no source or worse, with no survivor left. Wind whipped water into sheets that slicked my coat, but I barely felt the cold. I crouched by the rusted footings, palm brushing streaks of iron bleed, and pressed the recorder on. Its little meter jumped instantly, surging higher than any level I'd caught in the city. A bloom wider, sharper, angrier. Somewhere in the frequencies this place had been made permanent, like the ground still remembered what the tower once carried. Those footings weren't ruins. They were roots, and roots can still feed. I sat there, crouching against the storm, trying to slow breath. The scanner clawed into my ears until thought frayed. The rain itself seemed to pulse in rhythm, drops falling as if guided, each second aligning with the buried pattern. Lightning cracked, and for a moment, I saw the field lit up bone white. No tower, but something present nonetheless. Something feasting unseen, broadcast still alive in the downpour. I realized that I wasn't chasing the signal. It was waiting to be found. My scraps of data, the loops, my obsessive mapping, they hadn't created direction. They had only been read instructions, left plain inside the rain for me to pick apart. The bloom wasn't just accident. Someone or something had carved path inside chaos. And now I had followed it all the way here, knees wet in farmland muck. heart sinking unwillingly into the storm's iron rhythm. I hung onto the scanner as its howl blurred into my skull, no longer only loud but insistent. I thought of my brother suddenly, how he vanished during a night of storms, and how maybe he too had been pulled toward a call disguised in rainfall. I couldn't escape the thought that this was the same hand reaching, dragging line after line of us closer to a place where towers rise and fall, but the root signal stays alive. Distance had closed. Secrets had grown teeth. The corn bent hard in wind around me, as though the whole field leaned toward that very epicenter. I should have left. I should have driven, abandoned gear, filed it all under delusion. But I didn't. Instead, I steadied the recorder, ignored the cold water running into my shirt collar, and kept listening. Pulse in the ears, howl in the scanner, bloom in the spectrum layered all together into a shape so heavy it pinned me down. Somewhere out in the static, the tone shifted half a note higher, impossibly deliberate. My breath stalled. There it was again. A distress call not for rescue, but for recognition. I had no answers, no escape. Only the knowledge that I had been pulled deeper, and the storm pressed harder with approval. I didn't want to show anyone. Sharing meant admitting it was real, not just a phantom caught in long nights of storm and exhaustion. But secrecy curdles fast, and after what I found at the field, I needed someone else's ears. So I called the only person I trusted enough, a ham operator I'd known for years. Retired now, more at home with dusty manuals and forgotten transceivers than with people, but sharp. The kind of man who lived half in frequencies already. He humored me with a small roll of eyes, fingering the recorder like it was a child's toy. He plugged it through an adapter, adjusted volumes. Static filled the room, mingling with the storm outside, rattling loose glass panes. His grin hung in place as he leaned near to listen, but then it flickered. Because the hum cut through, steady and clear, bending his signal readouts right in front of him. The pattern sat unmoving across his equipment, shouldering aside other bands like they didn't exist. For a moment, all the rain chatter disappeared, overwritten. He frowned and tapped dials like maybe it was a crossed wire, faulty filters. But the more he fought knobs and switches, the stronger it grew. That look crossed his face, the look when a professional stops dismissing and starts fearing. He shut the main switch abruptly, cutting hiss from the room. Silence pressed heavy. He sat back, rubbing his chin. "Don't ever broadcast that," he said, voice lower. He stared at the tape deck like it was alive. I asked him why, what he thought it was. He muttered about old experiments, storm-born trigger work, things never meant for amateur bands. His eyes didn't meet mine as he added, most of them were shut down. Or claimed to be. I pressed for details, but he stayed cagey, like touching memory that could still burn him. Instead, he pulled a ledger from a stack handwritten logs he'd kept for decades. Rain nights, cross-band checks, everything timed. He flipped through with fingers hardened by years of switches. His face grew paler line by line. Because there it was. Every heavy storm, some entry marked anomaly. An unnatural steady spike, always sweeping and cleaner than surrounding chatter. His notes sometimes chalked it up to power surge or lightning scatter, but turned pattern now undeniable dot, then he froze on a page 4 years back. Storm date circled. His pencil note scrawled. Spike stronger than common. Overrides banned for several minutes. I leaned in and felt my ribs clench. That was the night. The same night my brother vanished in storm thick as a wall. I had never tied his absence to radio, not with proof, only memory of rain muffling everything. Now his coded scribbles dragged that thread into daylight. The ham operator closed the book fast. Too fast, like to hide what we both saw. He pushed it aside and reached for his cigarette tin, though his hand shook lighting one. "Forget you came," he muttered. "Logs don't prove anything solid. Just quirks." But he wouldn't meet my eyes. Proof lives not just in paper, but in the way a man tries to bury it again the second it surfaces. I walked circles in his cluttered room, feeling suffocated. My grief and this interference had just braided tight. I wanted to scream at him, demand why he hadn't warned me back then. But what would I have done with a warning? I was barely holding on as it was. I steadied myself, asked instead what had shut the experiments down, but he shook his head like a man hiding chains. Words like sensitive and above clearance trickled out, but nothing concrete. Outside, rain slammed the roof hard. Inside, the tape sat between us like a living thing. I could still hear its pulse and phantom sound, though the gear was off. I thought of my brother's laugh crackling through a cheap shortwave, how proud he was to fix scavenged sets. He would have chased the signal too. The thought stabbed sour. Maybe he already had. And maybe that's why he'd never come back. The operator ground ash into a plate and told me again in a firmer tone, "Don't chase it. Some signals are accidents," he said. "Others are sent out to see who listens." He gave me that long look, the careful kind, the one that can harden a man into silence. But I had crossed the line already. My proof was real. His logs whispered it, even when his lips refused. My brother's night wasn't random. When I left, the storm poured stronger. Wipers beating futile. In my passenger seat, the recorder case sat heavier again. A slab of truth strapped shut. I kept replaying his words, trying to twist them safe, but the fact rang harder than thunder, coordinated spikes. Every storm, logged by a reluctant hand, one aligning exactly with my loss. Rain hides and rain carries. The signal chooses storms for reasons I don't yet grasp. I pulled over once on the country road, flung the wipers up, and sat staring through rain blur, chest hollow. I held the recorder in my hands, whispered my brother's name into the black hum of stormfall, half daring the pulse to answer. Of course it didn't, but that absence was worse. Silence bleeding through felt like taunt. The tape left no comfort, only a doorway between grief and proof. By the time I drove home, everything outward looked the same: storm clouds dragging across telephone wire, fields soaked dark. But nothing inside me matched what came before. The line had sharpened. My brother's absence and the rain signal shared time, shared route. Whatever I'd stumbled over held him too, one way or another. I closed the door that night, house trembling to thunder, and switched the recorder back on, though I swore I wouldn't, just to hear. The hum surfaced instantly. I sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, whispering to the pulse though no one could answer. Despair curling in, but sharper purpose too. The trail wasn't erased. The rain had kept it. The hum carried it. And now I had first proof. The night he vanished has never let go of me. I replay it more clearly than I replay birthdays, sunlight, anything alive. The storm came down savage, walls of water hammering roof and siding. Every tree bent like surrender. I remember the sound most relentless, drowning even the clap of thunder. That was the night silence became total, not absence of sound but burial by it. My brother walked out into it, saying he'd be quick, but he did not come back. For years I kept the memory wrapped, convincing myself it was chance. People vanish, storms swallow detail. Police file reports that molder until nothing but paper remains. But when I listen, now really listen, the fragments of that night rearrange. I remember the house's kitchen light flickering, his radio hissing louder than usual on the counter. And underneath it, a low beat. Not thunder, not interference I could name. Just one pulse repeated, like the storm itself inhaled a secret. I never told anyone I heard it then. It seemed shameful somehow, weak, as though memory invented weight to justify grief. But silence keeps cracking open. After seeing the logs, after watching proofs claw through the band's old men still fear to mention, I can't ignore it. The night he disappeared wasn't storm alone. Something else seeped through the rainfall, and I was there to hear its edges even if I buried it down. No more burying. Not now. I went to the attic and dragged down what was left of him. His gear set locked inside a trunk, edges coated in dust thick as felt. My hands shook unlocking it. Inside, coils of wire, rusted antenna sections, a field notebook half eaten by silverfish. At the bottom, his radio portable but heavy, casing scratched, volume knob slightly bent. The smell hit hard. Dust mixed with that faint copper tang that rides old circuits. I hadn't touched it since the week we cleaned his room, since the week everyone told me to move forward. Forward meant proving nothing. I set the radio on my desk, plugged it in, let its minute red light glow like a heart restarting. The storm had been growing since afternoon, waiting like an accomplice outside. When rain finally surged, I held my breath and turned the dial across dead air. For a while I heard only hiss and tap of water. But then, sudden and familiar, the hum. The same low pulse, unaltered across years, nested clean under storm wash. The spectrum confirmed what my ear already knew. Peaks at perfect intervals. 3 minutes between flares, one steady rhythm beneath. Identical to my current recordings. My throat closed. That night years ago, I hadn't imagined it. He had heard this exact thing, loud through the same radio, standing at the same window. It wasn't random. It was personal. Watching the graph print pattern after pattern, I felt heat in my face like rage, like shame at doubting myself for so long. We had both been marked that night. I leaned close, remembering how he once huddled over this equipment, laughing at nonsense transmissions, marveling at voices creeping in from 1,000 miles. He lived for contact, but what he heard that last night wasn't contact. It was incursion. Rain acting as bridge, the hum carried across. If he followed it further, if he stepped into the storm listening hard, that might explain why he never came back. A shiver throbbed through me then. Past and present collapsed. The tape I run in secret, the tests, the signals inflicted on my head, they all pointed back. I wasn't intruding on stray interference. I was retracing him, following the same path step for step. My grief had grown arms and was pulling me forward whether I wanted or not. I wiped rust flecks off the casing, thumb tracing scratches he left. I wanted to shout at him across years that he should have stayed inside, shut it off, let it be. But I already knew I would do no different. The promise was inside me, to uncover what he heard, to understand what the signal demands when it arrives disguised as weather. That resolve bit harder than any warning. The storm outside rattled the gutters white with water. Every downpour had become a dare now. Each raindrop wasn't calm or cleansing. It was suspicion made manifest. What secret do you hide? What door are you? That night I pressed headphones on and leaned into the pulse. It was the same tempo as my heart, or maybe my heart adapted to it. Either way, I was bound. I remembered his last words, casual, spoken before stepping into storm dark. Back in a minute. A promise measured shorter than reality. The signal measures in minutes too exact, unbending. Had he timed himself into its pattern? Had he been claimed because he listened harder than most? The imagination spun savage circles, but all I could cling to was that this was more than coincidence, deeper than misfiled logs. I wrote it plain in my notebook. This isn't interference. This is personal. My brother and I tethered by hum that travels through storms. He walked first. I walk next. Both of us chosen or cursed by a pattern that insists on being noticed. I closed the old notebook he once kept. His handwriting had notes about antenna angles, weather stations, and scribbles of call signs. But there at the margins, faint pencil scratching, heard steady tone tonight. Not sure if external. I froze. Proof he had marked it too. Proof he had seen it first. My chest shook reading those words, a ghost message for me years late. The rain thickened. Thunder rolled. I sat in that storm with his gear alive again, his hum alive again, and knew the path stretched only forward. Grief no longer separate from interference. They were the same fabric, different strands woven through each other. The rain that had once given silence after pain now only fills me with questions. So I vow it, playing to myself, whispering into the drone, I will uncover what he heard. Whether it was accident, experiment, or door left ajar, I will not let it stand only as absence. If storms write coordinates and pulses bend proof, then proof will lead to him, or what remains of him. Either way, the hum pulled us both. And I cannot stay still. He didn't look like much at first. Just a retired technician, hair gone white too early, hands stained by years of solder and graphite. But when he leaned close over the recorder I brought him, the worn lid of my duffel opened between us. I felt the shift. He pressed one ear toward the speaker, eyes narrowing, face drained of humor. The hum cut steady through the hiss, and after a long breath he said flat and certain, "That's not civilian." The words sank like a blade. They came from someone who had logged decades inside machines that never made the public face of broadcast. He didn't call it strange. He didn't call it broken. He named its category by absence, military or darker. Not for common ears. He played the loop again, each pulse bruising the silence. Then he shut it off with 2 quick taps, as though keeping the sound present in his home too long might invite something. I asked him what it reminded him of. He thumbed ash from an invisible cigarette, though he no longer smoked. "Storm-linked monitoring," he muttered. "We caught these spikes sometimes." Tag said non-attributable transmissions. Official lying was equipment drift. But we weren't fooled. He lifted one shoulder like he wanted to shrug it off but couldn't. He spoke low, as though walls eavesdropped. Each entry got stored, filed away. Shelf-bound in print, no one read. Then, eventually, locked under storm weather experiment backlog. That phrase stuck in my skull. Non-attributable, without origin. A soundtrack but denied. He pulled from a file folder he'd kept after leaving a sin, he admitted, but one he excused as personal curiosity. The FOIA requests had come through decades later. Inside were copies, gray and blurred, leaked documents stamped declassified across. I scanned the pages. Lines of numeric readings, timestamps matching heavy rainfall. And words repeated in margins. NAT, non-attributable transmission. Always during rain events. Always written and then buried. He watched me too close as I read, like measuring how I held the weight. "You wanted truth," he said flat. "Here's the truth. Too much digging backfires. Monitoring committees like these frequencies asleep. They let files rot for a reason." I asked what reason. His gaze dropped to my recorder. "They don't want to know what keeps speaking during storms." His voice cracked a little there. For all his caution, I saw in him a shadow of my own obsession. Something haunted him still. He reached again into his folder, produced a scrap with a handwritten note. This one wasn't from FOIA. It was his own memory, penciled from 30 years back, cross-referenced with plant irrigation reports. "There's a reel," he said finally. "An old magnetic archive, mislabeled, filed under agricultural weather logs at the state library. Someone shoved it there, whether by accident or intent, you decide which. It's been waiting. Might still be." The idea of an actual reel sitting on some forgotten shelf twisted my veins. A recording older than mine, than the operator's, maybe catching the same storm signature years back. I wanted to press him harder, but he shifted in his seat with that unmistakable gesture done talking. He had given more than safe. His hand trembled slightly as he pulled the folder back and snapped it closed. He leaned forward. A warning burning quiet. "Be careful. Storm tapes drag longer than you plan. I've seen men spend entire lives cataloging signals that won't end. The more you press, the more it presses too. His eyes flicked to the rain-glossed window, like even speaking an extra word might draw the pulse alive inside. I wanted to counter, explain that proof was worth it, that silence kills heavier. But his expression silenced me first. He looked like a man who had already fought and lost. The hum lingered in my memory while we sat there. No sound in the room anymore, but my pulse. He tapped the recorder once more, pushed it back toward me. Whatever this is, it isn't whining through towers. It isn't broken preamps. It isn't yours to solve clean. But maybe you'll find that real. If it's still there. That's your lead, for what it's worth. Just weigh what it costs. I left with rain spattering the hood of my car, his warning etched deep, yet the clue heavier still. I could feel the misfiled reel humming in my mind, tempting with its age, its secrecy. In my bag, the recorder thudded against my thigh, as though agreeing. If storms hide thresholds, then that reel might show the first crossing caught to tape dot as I drove off. The storm broke heavier, streaking down glass while the wipers barely kept up. The road gleamed black, glowing with reflections of sodium lamps, and each flash of lightning lit the sky like a sheet pulled back. My mind tunneled into the documents he showed. The thin language officials used to bury what scared them. Non-attributable, non-explained, non-human. Words designed to close files instead of open them. A library shelf. A reel lost under the disguise of farm records. I gripped the wheel tighter. I had proof now that others had heard what I was hearing. They had noted it, logged it, and locked it away. That made my pursuit less delusion and more confrontation. Something had been spilling through storm bands long before me. And now I had direction, not safe, not wise, but clear dot. By the time I reached my street, the rain had thinned, but the thought would not. The insider's last words replayed every step up to my door. Be careful. Monitoring committees let storms breathe quiet. They want you deaf. They want you blind. But if storms are doors, then the reel could be the first crack left open. Proof carved in oxide. Before my brother even walked out into thunder, the idea that someone placed it wrong on purpose clung hardest. That maybe one hand 30 years back wanted someone like me to find it later. The rain tapped steady on the gutters as I locked the door, and in that rhythm, I heard it again. The hum didn't just bleed into storms. It bled into me. Next storm, next search, next reel. I knew I was already following. The state library smelled of dust, damp paper, and polish that never quite covered the age. Rows of cabinets stood like gravestones, labeled by the hand of clerks long retired. I carried the slip of paper the insider had scrawled for me and followed signs. Down a narrow corridor where no visitors seemed to wander. Agricultural logs. Weather reports stacked into reels of tape no one remembered. Filing was imperfect, he said. Some things slotted where they didn't belong. I walked slow, heart thrumming louder than my footsteps, and opened the drawer. Soil moisture reports. Climate surveys. Charts on irrigation, mislabeled and fading at the corners. And tucked at the back, there it was. One reel, unnumbered, the handwriting across its tab faint and rushed. 6 minutes, it claimed. A rain sample from 1973. Nothing about origin. Nothing about machine or band. Just the cool understatement of bureaucracy. But the reel weighed heavy in my hands, as though it remembered what it carried. Dust clung in sheets. My fingers left prints across it like accusations. I signed nothing, wrote nothing down. Simply slipped the reel into my bag, then traced my way to an unused reading room. One corner still held an archive player, its head cleaned barely enough to sputter life. Power hummed weak through the outlet. I threaded tape, clumsy from disuse, and leaned close as reels turned. Hiss filled the air, raw and immediate. It began with rain. A steady curtain, microphones pointed outward from some unknown attic long gone. No voices, no notes, only downpour captured in measurable grooves. At first I thought it truly was farming material, background weather cut for study. I stared at the floorboards, bitter disappointment swelling. But then it came. The hum, unmistakable, identical in tone and strength to mine. A low pulse biting through stormwash. My chest tightened. I struck the pause button, sweating despite the chill. I lined my portable recorder against the player's output, pressed record, watching my own spectrum in real time. Perfect alignment. Every interval identical to the spikes I had mapped from current storms. Across decades, the pulse persisted pristine. Whoever had captured it, they had heard the same impossible signature, and like me, they had not erased it. My breath shook out of rhythm with the rain. The ghost was older than me, older than my brother, maybe older than most of us knew. Minutes swelled with this proof. A hum repeated beneath storm sound, pinned into oxide tape like an insect held fast in amber. But near the end, things shifted. The last 30 seconds twisted out of comfort. Noise wove into the tone, not voices, not static and drift, but modulation rising crooked. A jagged chord stretched raw, guttural, something pressing inward but misshapen, wrecking the clean repetition. My stomach clenched, the way it had that night looping tones back through headphones, until my skull hurt. Someone's hand decades back had heard this same swell and recorded through it. I replayed it twice, palms clammy, verifying my ears weren't inventing. Each time the chord warped identically, like a blunt instrument scraping against frequency. Not music, not words. An edge brushing against consciousness, searching for shape. My head swam and I had to kill power. The reel sat turning still, its tapes slackened to inertia. In the silence, I almost thought I could still hear that modulation chewing the air. I wondered about the archivist who first listened. Did they pause at the surge, cold prick at the scalp, and decide to file it away under farm data? Mislabeled by mistake or by design? Hiding proof in plain sight, ensuring only the desperate or the cursed would ever stumble across it. The insider had been right. It waited. A breadcrumb left not for the committee, not for the agencies, but likely for me or someone like me. I wiped sweat and dust equally from my brow, gathered the reel back into its case, and sat staring at my notes. The years no longer protected anyone. The rain had always kept rhythm, layering one storm to another across generations. Each listener, each recording, unknowingly part of the same score. I felt less like I had found a ghost, and more like the ghost had reached through, reminding me it did not need introduction. I thought of my brother then, and the cheap notebook he scratched into. How maybe, just maybe, he had stumbled across the same jagged chord before vanishing. And if he had, it wasn't coincidence. It was continuity. My hands shook steady as the rain's pulse when I packed the reel back into my bag. The air in the library heavy as if the walls too had remembered. Proof wasn't fresh. It had lineage, preserved by storm after storm. Outside, rain leaked from the sky, brushing windows with soft percussion. I felt the chord humming still, even as I walked. Whoever recorded that decades ago had passed it forward like inheritance. And now it belonged to me, lodged raw in bone. The rain kept time, and I could never again pretend that time belonged only to weather. The reel haunted me long after its jagged chord faded. Proof wasn't enough anymore. Proof demanded context. I wanted archives stacked against my own logs, cross-checked until they folded into pattern undeniable. So I turned to weather station records, combing databases that smelled of dust even through a screen's glow. Thin text files, faded scans, engineering notes uploaded by interns who never knew what they guarded. At first it felt like digging in sand with bare hands. Stray rainfall entries, wind directions, storm advisories. Then the gaps became obvious, whole nights gone. Logs broken with jagged error tags where storms had raged. Files stamped corrupted, dates missing like snapped stitches. When I lined them chronologically, They made a map of absence. And every absence sat squarely on top of heavy downpour nights. Too precise to pass as glitch. Weather stations can fail, yes, lightning can kill a line. But across sites, across states, always the same? This was intent. Someone had cut pieces away. I clicked deeper into regional subfolders and found more holes. Logs labeled blank with no reason. Bursts of rainfall data, intact before and after, but in between, a silence that hammered louder than words. I stacked them against my own notebooks, shaking all the while. The nights missing lived inside the same rain calendars I had charted for my pulse patterns. Erased nights stared at me like scars. Not accidents. Clean silences pressed over chaos. The thought pressed bile to my throat. This wasn't data lost to storm. This was data scrubbed from memory by deliberate hand. Someone had sifted through decades of turbulent rain and left only the emptiest nights behind. As if afraid of what storms kept tucked inside them. Official files curated to display only weather, never the guests that hitchhiked through. I leaned to my screen as storm hissed against my window. My body burned down its core, knowing the erasure was proof itself. Because missing logs confirm presence bigger than any signal still audible. My obsession no longer whispered. Now it screamed through negative space. I grew reckless by midnight. I took one of the so-called corrupted files, a remnant I salvaged from an older archive mirror. Its audio portion glitched, halting in broken shards. But within the slivers of buzz, I caught an echo. I clipped it, looped it, then layered against one of my current recordings. My software pinned them over like transparent film. Waves found symmetry. Peaks met precisely. Even the interval matched, like one voice still mimicked its elder. My stomach dropped hard with the click of alignment. It was never destroyed. Just hidden. Covered under corrupted tags and silence placeholders. But the tone lived on, patient. Whoever erased history couldn't erase the pulse itself. Storm still carried it, and I was catching their afterimage now. I stared at my desk surface until tears fogged my eyes. For years, committees, agencies, archivists, those careful hands silenced their tracks. They wanted no trail. But the storm was never theirs to cage. The storm remembered. I thought back to my brother. The night of his leaving. Had his signal, his final listening, been one of those erased logs? Had a committee clerk tapped delete on the one gust that took him from me? The idea took my breath into broken points. Proof was no longer calm. Proof was corrosive. Knowing someone knew and buried it left me shaking. Fists tight at my sides. My room ticked with electronics and rain. I felt surrounded not just by storms, but by archives mutilated and reshaped. I scrolled file after file, each missing entry echoing like a scar. Each absence a fresh shout of confirmation. Old slogan said data never dies, it only hides. I tasted the bitterness of that in my mouth now. The enemy wasn't absence. It was erasure. I pulled my recordings together on one drive, stacked them with the corrupted overlays, annotated intersections. Pages filled with scribbles fell across the floor. The hum pressed from headphones into the hollows behind my skull. My own voice muttered truths rawer than I dared speak aloud. It was scrubbed. It persists. Proof, corruption, persistence. All tangled, all bound together, and me wrapped straight into their coils. The rain outside slammed harder, and with each blow against the glass it sounded less like weather and more like insistence. I found myself whispering back, promising as though I owed debt. Promising to not let their erasures hold. Promising to echo louder. Every corruption would be undone. Every absence proven full. It terrified me, but it was already too late. In that moment, I realized I had become redundancy. My recordings weren't just obsession. They were survival copies of something larger that systems sought to erase. Every file I saved extended the ghost's lineage one notch further down time. Erased once, but not again. I was the echo someone tried to kill. And the more I thought it, the more the hum grew steady in my ears until silence itself felt unnatural. I leaned back, exhausted, yet aware the hunt had turned. I wasn't just documenting anymore. I was resisting erasure, standing against hands skilled in burying storms under blank files. Resistance cost dearly, I knew. Still, as lightning flared at glass and thunder grumbled like shifting earth, I smiled bitter in the glow of the screen. They had erased the trail, but I stood living proof that the signal still moved. Tears blurred code lines, and I whispered once to my absent brother, "I am keeping it alive." You heard it. I hear it still. They can scrub logs to bone, but storms keep time, and I am part of it now. The storm began soft that night, a curtain hiss instead of a hammer. I sat at my desk with the recorder running live, headphones pressed, pen balanced above my logbook. Same drill as every rain now. Mark each pulse, chart its intervals, overlay against past notes. Predictable, even comforting in its warped way. The hum ticked steady as a second hand. My body had learned its rhythm well enough that heartbeats sometimes matched it involuntarily. I had no reason to expect it would betray its own rules, but deep into midnight, the pattern cracked. At first it was a subtle stagger, like one step lengthened in a long march. I leaned forward, ears sharper, pulse quickening. The next interval hit late again, not quite aligned to 3 minutes. Then the thunder outside rumbled, thunder that didn't match the graphs I'd grown to trust. My pen scratched a question mark on paper. And then it came. Not the hum, not the low constant. A burst, 3 rising tones stacked clean over one another, sharp enough to make me flinch back from the headphones. My notebooks clattered to the ground at my feet. The tones swelled, climbed like a signal clearing its throat, then stopped dead. The hum fell silent. Only rain remained for a breath, so long it felt like dying. Then the baseline hum returned as if nothing had happened. I scrabbled after my pen, hands shaking, ink bleeding across wet smears as I wrote down the exact count of seconds. Rain drummed at the windows in mocking rhythm. I checked my spectrum view. The tones were visible, jagged peaks cutting into the regular band. Proof alive, etched clean. For the first time in these long nights, the signal had broken its own silence. It had spoken. The implication struck harder than the storm outside. If it could alter itself, then it could act. Agency lived here. This wasn't an accidental resonance or passive bleed. This was choice. Change meant noticing, meant reaction. Me calling into emptiness, and emptiness finally tapping back. 1, 2, 3. A knuckle against the other side of a wall dot. My ally agreed to hear it the next morning against his better judgment. I carried the fragment over, taped into my portable player, hands clammy. His expression tried to stay blank, but as the 3 tones rang out, the corners of his mouth sank. He rubbed his palm across stubble and muttered, "That wasn't random." His voice carried weight like a man renewing an old fear. I asked again and again what he thought. Feedback? Artifact? His head shook each time. I've logged thousands of freak pulses. They fade or blur. That was deliberate. Like call and response without the words. Then he shut himself down, lips sealed, eyes elsewhere. The same look he wore when refusing to elaborate on old scars. He refused to hold the tape again. He warned me not to dwell. But he didn't deny it. Denial gone meant everything. Back home, the tones played on loop in my mind. Static that wasn't static. A message so simple, it rattled time. The effect was unnerving, not just in sound but in its intrusion. I felt my skin prickle while working through notes, like something unseen kept its gaze on me. A realization bloomed sick and final. If it could change, then it could notice. That thought doubled the fear. All this time I believed I was looking in, documenting from distance. Obsession, yes, but mine. But what if lines run both ways? What if each night, crouched over meters and charts, I had been waving a torch in thick dark, and something finally turned its head to see me? The rain that night no longer felt like cover. It pressed on windows like a presence, alive with weight. Every drop a nail in walls too thin. Sound traveled both directions. Doors opened both sides. I replayed the clip, heart accelerating all over again. 3 tones, rising, sharp. A summons, a signal, or perhaps just acknowledgement. But acknowledgement is enough. I realized then my notebooks scattered across the floor weren't just records now. They were correspondence. One column of the conversation. And the hum had just answered with its first line. I stared long into the blue screen glow until my handwriting blurred. My chest hurt, taut as string. I wanted to deny it again, but denial was wasted. I felt it plain. I was not only studying, I was being studied in return. The storm reached its height just as midnight struck. I was already awake, waiting, headphones against my skull, recorder armed. Habit had dulled fear. It was always the same cycle. Low hum, steady rhythm, the occasional bloom. I thought I knew its range. But this night split everything open. The hum did not start as expected. Within the first minutes, the signal bent, warped at its edges until it no longer felt like the same voice I had followed for months. Instead of a clean pulse marked on my graphs, I heard a swell, broad and crushing, growing wide like an entire room vibrating. It wasn't deafening. It didn't need to be. Volume stayed mild, yet the sensation covered every angle. Not in my ears only, but in throat, chest, even bones. A chord so wide it felt infinite. I leaned forward, rattled but locked. My pen slipped. I clutched the desk harder. The sound didn't fade or spike in bursts. It coated everything. The nearest comparison I found was standing inside a faulty generator room, every surface humming, crawling electric. Except there was no machine here. Just storm and tape. Minutes passed or seconds. Hard to tell as dizziness overtook me. I yanked off headphones, but the resonance clung, a phantom echo gripping the inner ear. I touched both lobes with trembling hands, half convinced blood would rise. No damage I could see, but silence offered no relief. The cord had already stamped itself into my nerves. I staggered across the room, tried to breathe, but my balance staggered too. Every step skewed sideways like the ground protested me. I scrambled to cut playback entirely. Only then did the haze ease, leaving my skull ringing, even and quiet. The storm beyond still lashed glass, but I knew the storm wasn't guilty. The storm was the medium. The distortion rode it, and I had walked straight into its core. I sat slumped for nearly an hour, sweating cold through clothes, ears still touched by phantom drone. I wanted to write my notes, but every word shook. This wasn't reception. This wasn't interference. This was resonance, an entire body pulled into the field. If a tone could shape a room, could reshape my own perception, then I wasn't an observer anymore. I was substrate. In the morning, I carried the file to my ally, against sense, against patience. His face drained when I explained how the sound lingered, even when cut. I played him a fragment through low volume. He stiffened, shut it down. His words landed sharp. That isn't transmission. That's resonance. My confusion must have shown, because he leaned closer and whispered, "A transmitter doesn't only send sound. It can shape the space around the listener. Shape memory. Shape you." That whatever it is wasn't asking to be heard. It was bending what heard it. The warning hurt more than relief could. My ribs carried ache from the night still, a buzzing weight that refused to leave. I asked him what lasting harm could live in resonance. He shook his head, lines drawing deeper into his forehead. Depends how long you sat in it. Depends whether you stopped soon enough. He wouldn't say more. Alone again, I replayed the memory in silence. My room had felt larger. That cord filled its corners like air-bending architecture. What if it had pressed further? What happens when a transmitter doesn't want to communicate, but to inhabit? Every reel I had played, every tape I stored, began to feel less like proof and more like open doors cracked wider with each storm. I thought of my brother then. Had he stepped into not just a sound but a resonance too deep to climb back from? At dusk, I felt phantom rings still pulsing behind my ears. A faint aftertaste of vibration sat under even casual silence. The possibility lodged like a splinter. What if it wasn't fading at all, but embedding? What if this hum was cumulative, layering deeper each night? I pressed my hands over ears, futile gesture. Listening was no longer passive. It had never been. The storm outside shaped into lull, though gutters still ran loud. I sat clutching notes, pages scattered, aware the pattern had changed. The line between evidence and intrusion had collapsed. I could not be sure how much of me belonged to myself. Each reel had become a door, forcing open gaps between listener and sound. Doors, however, opened both ways, and I had no way of knowing what had already stepped through. The days stretched quiet, sun-pressing heat across cracked sidewalks, sky bare of cloud. No storms to test, no rain to hide under. For the first time in months, the air carried nothing but cicadas and passing cars. I kept watch anyway, fingers restless on silent knobs, waiting for weather radar to smear with color again. Silence should have felt like reprieve, but it didn't. It pressed heavier than any droning pulse. Each night I tried to sleep earlier, telling myself that absence meant luck, that maybe I had chased a mirage extended by fatigue. The voice of reason whispered that stress explains distorted hearing, and faulty archives explain gaps. But even as I half believed, my body didn't. Silence wasn't absence anymore. It was withholding. A withheld word during conversation. A breath paused before the blow lands. I found myself pressing headphones close, though nothing played, hoping to catch stray vibration beneath air conditioner hum. Hours passed with no rain and no pulse. Only my breath sinking against hollow hiss. Each cycle of quiet felt pointed, as if storms had shifted away, not by season but by design, granting me empty days to taste what life could be like without the hum. But it wasn't mercy. It was reminder. Silence as strategy. When storm finally broke a week later, heavy drops streaking glass, I jolted upright and ran cables like a man starved. Recorder spun, spectrum display bloomed blue. Rainfall surged steady, masked everything else. I leaned in, waiting for the low hum to cut, the patient pulse to reignite. Minutes slid into hours, snores of thunder rolling, but beneath, nothing. Just rainfall, chaos natural. I felt a moment's relief, as if freed, as if this silence proved safety. But the relief twisted thin, betrayed by memory of how calculated the hum had always been. It wasn't gone. It was choosing not to show. And that meant it knew when. It had control. Storm wrapped the house, tapping gutters, slamming rooftops, filling drains with currents I could smell through sealed glass. I sat cross-legged near the rig, waiting, scribbling zeros into columns, no anomaly, no bloom. But my heart drummed faster in the absence than it ever did during intrusion. Because silence extended long enough to make me wonder if this night itself was the trap that my brother's last storm returned clear. How thick the rain had been. How I told myself then that nature swallowed him, nothing more. But now I asked darker questions. Had he too sat through nights of only rainfall, thinking he was safe? Did he step out that final time because he confused silent strategy with surrender? My guts turned tight, imagining his last breath, not as mistake but as bait. I stayed wired into the headphones so long that awareness of myself blurred. Not hearing made the absence louder, a hollow roar with shapes waiting to slip through. I reset gain levels, toggled filters, stared unblinking at the spectrum, but the line traced flat. If something could choose its entry point, then it had been watching, evaluating, waiting for maximum intrusion. Towards dawn the rain lightened. I had found nothing. Still, I couldn't shut the recorder. The thought coiled in me that turning it off would answer back, give it more than it took, invite engagement by conceding attention. I let tape spin longer than necessary, balancing dread against instinct. In that stretch of fatigue and paranoia, one thought cut hardest. The silence wasn't for me. It was for itself. A tactic in patience. A kind of flex that let me know I couldn't rely on rules. Strategy disguised as emptiness. Some silences are traps. The hum had taught me that its voice could fill every second. Now it taught me that absence itself was a weapon sharper. I sat staring at the recorder's red light blinking into pale dawn, wondering if letting it run longer meant offering part of myself away. Each reel becomes a doorway, and I had left mine open, waiting. The silence had grown unbearable, a waiting game I couldn't endure any longer. If the signal had agency, if it could alter itself when it wanted, then I needed to know if it could be reached. The idea crawled from the back of my skull until it filled every thought. So I pulled down an old shortwave rig from the attic, its casing dented, knobs stiff with dust, but still wired strong enough to carry tones. I set it on the desk beside my recorder, hands trembling as I dug for cables, antenna coil half rusted but workable. Outside, the rain began steady, thickening into the perfect storm sleeve to hide transmission. I told myself this was fair, proper symmetry. Storms had carried it to me. Storms would now carry me to it. I stared at the signal log one more time, measured the tempo I had charted across months, triple-checked interval spacing. And then I dialed the frequency open, pressed transmit. A simple tone spilled into the rain. 1 second long, steady. A mirror of what had once been fed to me. I repeated it, pulse after pulse, forcing myself into rhythm strict enough to match their own. I leaned toward the band scope, watched static clutter swirl with rainfall, but no spike came in answer. Minutes stretched into hours. I cycled pulses higher, lower, even sent 3 rising tones to mimic the burst it had once gifted me. But the rain carried only my imitation away, folding simple tones into static drifts. No reply ever broke through. Just noise, endless gray hiss. My notebook filled with check marks too many times scratched out. By 2 in the morning my throat was dry and my back ached. Futility pressed down, but more than futility, I felt exposed. Every second of transmission blared into night, not as conversation, but as announcement. I wasn't whispering. I was shouting my presence like a flare. In one instant I saw myself not as the chaser, but as the caught, standing spotlighted in storm, while nothing stirred in return. At last, I cut power, slumped in the chair, embarrassed by my own desperation. Fool screaming at storm. Static answered, but static was nothing. I packed wires in bundles, quick and unsteady, trying to clean signs of what I'd done. But the air inside the house felt shifted, as though something had turned and noticed. The rain against the windows hissed louder, sharper. A chorus waiting in plain disguise. The following evening I told my ally, voice quiet, ashamed but certain. His face snapped suddenly tight, no humor at all. He leaned close enough that I could smell solder in his clothes. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. His voice shook in spaces it never had before. "Transmitting isn't listening. You painted a target on yourself. You told it where you are." His eyes darted to the window, as if expecting the rain itself to lean in. He refused to touch my notebook, as though even numerals carried risk now. He only repeated the warning, "Never transmit again. For your sake." Then he shut the conversation down, the finality of a slammed door. Back home, his words echoed harder than any tone I had blasted outward. The house no longer felt like shelter. Walls seemed porous under rainfall's constant drumming. I walked the rooms, pausing, listening to every tap, each hiss carrying more implication. The rain wasn't just nature anymore, it was accomplice. Each droplet stitching my coordinates across the world's fabric. I couldn't step anywhere without believing the sound would betray me. Lying in bed, eyes to ceiling, I remembered pressing that transmit button. The exact moment power surged into antenna. The thought twisted into dread. What if my tones weren't ignored at all? What if they were logged, cataloged, and studied by whatever sat behind the storm? Failing to reach it didn't feel like safety. It felt like knocking against a locked door, while someone already stood silent on the other side. Listening, the rain whispered on the glass, steady, complicit. A live dot, I reached the breaking point slowly, as though carried by water filling a room. Weeks of storms, nights of vigil, mornings smudged with half-written notes. My body gave way first. Fingers cramped from constant scribbling, eyes bloodshot from glowing spectrums, ears pulsing even when no sound played. Sleep became fragments, shallow wires crossing each dream until I woke startled, certain the hum still poured into my head. One morning I snapped. Rage cut through exhaustion, and I dragged stacks of notebooks into a pile. Dozens of them, pages heavy with graphs and marginalia. I burned some in a metal bin, the rest I tore apart until paper snow sat across the floor. Days of rain-thick hours gone in minutes. I told myself this ended here. I closed the recorder, shoved wires into shelves, promised air into my lungs that I would stop, but storms don't approve promises. When the next downpour struck, I stepped to the window against my will. Notebooks gone, but urge remained. Fingers twitched, then unlocked drawers. I pressed record again before I even realized it. Against will, against vows. And there it was in the headphones, the hum. Only faint now, subtler, but alive. Almost mocking, like it knew I had tried escape and failed. I pressed stop and replayed. But playback wasn't faithful. The loop wavered, pitch bending slightly lower than live. I frowned, rewound again, checked my meters. Second playback carried a new aberration. Pacing slowed half a second, like someone adjusting reel little by little. I tested cables, checked software. Nothing explained it. Each rewind birthed a new ghost. Recorded history should be fixed. Grooves don't reinvent themselves. But these did. I fell into spirals of replay. Every cycle altered in tiny measures. Sometimes sharpness dulled, sometimes a phantom beat staggered off time. Cumulative unease built until I hardly trusted my ears. The signal had always intruded on present tense. Now it invaded past tense too. Memory betrayed by tape. Proof itself mutating under my hands. I sent fragments to my ally, desperate for anchor. He listened carefully, then insisted. Recordings don't mutate. Not like this. Hardware error at worst. You're overlaying paranoia. But I could hear the unease in his pauses. He wanted to believe in technical failure, but deep down he knew the truth too. What was happening should be impossible. And the impossible was happening anyway. I played the samples back to back for him, demonstrating subtle shifts. He shook his head, retreating from my desk like the sound was catching. "Stop torturing yourself," he muttered. "Stop listening." As though the command could unstitch obsession. But by then the damage was already seeded. Sleep crumbled further. Dreams copied the wrong versions of the hum. Sometimes I woke and couldn't recall if what I heard had come from genuine recording, or one of the mutants spawned mid-loop. Memories overlapped till meaning tore thin. I looked at still frames in my logs and swore they changed shapes when I blinked. I lay nights with headphones pressed tight, whispering into silence, unsure if I was replaying or living live feed. Every review carried new error. No playback matched memory. Nothing held. Reality began to fold into contingency. Doubt became heavier than dread. If recordings couldn't hold steady, how could my memory be trusted either? I had mapped an entire history of spikes and silences, but which parts remained true? Had I scribbled graphs from one edition of reality or 10, each twisting behind itself like mirrors? I tried again to destroy, deleting files, emptying drives. Yet echoes lingered. Deletion offered no true closure, because once heard, the hum already lived inside me. Each attempt at severance only amplified the sense that I was part of the unstable archive. Now. My ally repeated that information is stable. I repeated back that mine wasn't. He had no answer then. His silence was worse than denial. Nights blurred. I sat shivering in the blue glow, breath fogging faint from exhaustion, unable to say whether what poured in my ears was the original hum, a replay, or something new crawling out of resonance. Burnout didn't mean end. It meant smearing. I had become unstuck inside loops that no longer agreed with themselves. I stared at the recorder light blinking red, my only certainty the fact that nothing was certain. And in that collapse I realized I could no longer be sure what I had truly kept and what had already been replaced. It began with rumors before it reached the papers. Stories from small towns drifting online, scattered in forums nobody moderates. People muttering about radios screeching during rain, weather bands strangled into useless noise. Farmers saying their clocks jumped backward overnight, digital and analog alike, always when storms broke heavy. I scrolled through those half-believed anecdotes, stomach tightening as each post aligned with nights on my own logbook. One storm, one disruption, one distortion. Too consistent. The hum I thought had chained itself only to me had slipped beyond my walls. The local paper finally carried a piece. 3 days later. Unusual interference under investigation. Bland headline hiding real fear. A town only 30 miles away had reported wideband flooding during thunderstorms, radios reduced to buzzing walls of static. Some claimed to hear deep pulses within, as though thunderstorms now carried hidden tempo. The phrase jolted me clean awake, hidden tempo. My blood ran hot knowing someone else, someone far from me, had noticed rhythm too. It was no longer a private affliction. Something had spread. When the next storm arrived, the change showed sharp. I recorded as usual, set headphones, pen ready. But instead of the single pulse I had lived with for months, multiple hums bled against each other, overlapping, colliding into dissonance. Peaks rang close together, like several transmitters firing through the rain at once. I grabbed the desk edge to keep steady. Graphs bloomed with lines until the screen looked less like a signal and more like a wound torn open. I rushed copies to my ally. He didn't look surprised. He only nodded dark, pulled battered tapes from his own files. Strange scraps gathered from years of correspondence with storm watchers, farmers, even storm chasers who record wind for habit. Each tape crackled warped, blooming with anomalies, voices muffled half-frequencies, tones bleeding impossible clarity through tempests. He laid them out in a row like confession. "You're not alone," he said. "It's widening. Always has, only hidden." I played one fragment over headphones' grainy lightning strike background, then a chord matching my own distortion but cleaner. A farmer had recorded it standing inside his shed as rain split his field into rivers. The tape ended with his voice muttering confusion and fear. My ally tapped the cassette case, voice even. There are dozens like this. Different years, different places, all rain-tide. He lifted his eyes into mine, sharp. If storms are their doorway, then every rainy night is a threshold. That warning clamped my lungs. Rain was universal. Storms touched every town, every border, every body. What began as whisper into my headphones had always been larger field, now bleeding openly. The thought made me taste metal at the back of my throat. My grief no longer felt my own. My brother vanished inside something vast. Maybe dozens before him had too. The singular narrative I'd spun crumbled into chorus. News reports continued. Local power outages blamed on outdated equipment. Digital clocks failing at the same minute across whole blocks. Emergency calls jammed by static. Each official line wrote it off as weather, aging infrastructure, bored prankers. But every excuse rang hollow when measured beside my own recordings. The illusions of safety pressed thin. If the hum had decided to widen, excuses would not cork it back inside. One night during storm, I sat in dark with headphones and the multiple pulses colliding together. It didn't feel like chaos. It felt like growth. Several hums stitched across space, layered until rain itself transformed into medium heavy with presence. Each drop felt weaponized, each drop an envelope carrying unseen message. A chill ran through me. The rain was no longer weather. It was distribution. I closed my eyes against thunder and thought how many others were now pressing recorders in dark houses, bewildered and afraid, stumbling into the same haunting I carried. My grief had company. That truth cut both ways. It meant I wasn't crazy, not alone. But it also meant no walls, no neighborhoods would remain untouched once storms pressed everywhere. Once doors opened wide without regard for who listened, I scratched frantic and fresh notebook. It is bigger than me. It was never only me. I could no longer tell if that fact broke me into relief or splintered dread deeper. Because singular grief at least has borders. But grief multiplied has none. The storm outside roared into crescendo. 3 hums bled into one, spectrum blooming like a fracture across the screen. My head bowed low. I whispered my brother's name into the collision, feeling it instantly swallowed by the choir. I began with careful wording. Letters typed steady, forwarded to local weather stations, asking for calibration logs from storm nights. Plain and harmless, scientific curiosity. Responses trickled back faster than I expected, but thinner than I wanted. Some claimed no such logs existed. Others pushed me to general websites, filled with summaries that read like tourist brochures for weather. Nothing raw, nothing true. Replies were neat, clipped, rehearsed. I pressed again and again, but each time my inbox filled with denials that felt less like ignorance and more like fencing. I filed failure requests. Stubborn in procedure, asking for spectral records. Archived anomalies, anything rain-tide. Weeks passed. The envelopes came stamped the same familiar phrase in black. No responsive documents. Again. Storm nights stripped of data by design. I sat at my desk shredding envelopes, bile rising. If the hum were fiction, if it were madness, then answers would come easy. Casual dismissals shaken off by officials used to crank mail. But this silence, exact and unwavering, was louder than any tone I'd ever recorded. I called one office direct, voice cracking with forced calm, asking about interference reports. The man on the line paused long enough that I heard his breath grow shallow. Then he spoke clipped one note, not our department. Repeated it 3 times until I hung up. It wasn't dismissal. It was training. My ally leaned closer than usual when I told him. He muttered, not quite looking at me. Committee archives run deeper than you guess. Quiet hands smoother than concrete. They bury what disturbs consensus. He reminded me of agencies armed not with weapons, but storage. The kind that files whole nights out of existence, building silence brick by brick. The thought curdled through me. Erasure as governance. I pushed anyway, one more round, casting broader net. Universities, private labs, radio boards. Only polite replies now, all circling a vague theme. Storm phenomena unremarkable. Hardware drift, thank you for your interest. Each scripted sentence hardened not just refusal but investment. Someone had built a wall, high and hollow. Brick silence sat heavier than denial. And I had pressed nose against it. One night, staring down the stamped phrase again, I began to wonder which danger cut deeper. The signal or the silence stitched by human will. On one side, storms that bleed hum through circuits, bending time, bending sense. On the other, committees skilled at removing proof until a man talks to walls. Both dangers fed off each other. The hum is intrusion. The silence is cage. Together they ensure no one escapes with certainty alive. I lit a lamp late, scribbled in one of the few notebooks I hadn't burned. Each refusal confirms a boundary. Each denial a contour map of forbidden ground. Proof lives in absence as loud as in sound, yet the cost lingers sharp. If institutions have guarded against this for decades, if they invested hand after hand in burial, then carrying my fragments louder might trigger weight I can't absorb. Watching me, following, pressing down not with rain but with human pressure. Lightning split the sky outside, and the house rattled on its frame. I kept the recorder running anyway. I needed the hum more than I needed safety. Storms may hold voices impossible, but silence enforced by men is worse. My hands shook as I adjusted level on the dial, whispering to no one. Which danger cuts first? The signal itself, or those who know it exists? The storm arrived like a wall collapsing, sheets of rain driving sideways, hurling against glass. I had prepared this time, determined to test whether it was only proximity binding me to the hum. My recorder spun in the bedroom. My ally had his rig tuned 20 miles east. And a third, borrowed through strained favors, ran in another county to the north, operated by a man who barely understood what we were chasing. 3 points triangulating one storm. Proof would live or die here. Midnight thickened black as oil outside, lightning ripping quiet sky into sudden fire. I sat hunched by my desk, headphones biting into temples, watching spectrum lines surge. Then it hit. Not a hum, not a stagger, but a spike so vertical it seemed to puncture air directly. The recorder leapt into red. My ally rang my phone seconds later, his voice tin and urgent. Same here, exact. I heard lightning cracking through his receiver, then distortion aligning perfect, interval by interval. Minutes later a file from the third recorder arrived, scratched but intact. I laid them over each other, pulse aligned sharper than machinery should permit. Spikes tall, identical, not variance but synchronization. Once, I might have named it interference. Now staring at graphs blooming into each other like identical signatures, I named it something else entirely. Convergence. The rain outside thundered harder, pouring sound into every surface. And yet the hum rose high above thunder, too neat, too piercing. Layers of sky collapsed together, but the signal cut sharper than nature could ever carve. It wasn't under weather anymore. It was over it. I slammed headphones off, but my skull still vibrated. My ally texted blunt, furious. Not interference, convergence, a unified event. Words written plain cracked my chest open. A unified broadcast meant intent. Doors wide open meant invitation or command. And in that realization, memory bit down like lightning. My brother's last storm. Thick with rain, yes. But maybe thicker still with convergence, an earlier wave of this same event swelling unseen. What I long called disappearance might never have been random tragedy. He may have been swallowed inside instead, taken as storm roared. I stared at his old radio still sitting by the shelf. Dust curved around edges my fingers hadn't touched in weeks. Had this convergence already played through that night? Did he lean too close, hear too steady, and simply step forward without returning? The thought froze marrow. Proof no longer a bomb, but a knife. Proof meant he hadn't chosen to vanish. He had been taken. I listened again, daring despite dread. Noise layers doubled and tripled until graphs looked less like sound and more like architecture, a structure unfolding across storm bands. My ally's voice cracked over the phone, warning louder than before. Documentation isn't safe if this is convergence. Doors this wide don't close again. He sounded shaken, afraid in ways I hadn't heard from him yet. We both realized in silence that storms were teeth, gnashing open. I huddled in the dark, thunder rolling like artillery, remembering how I once thought notebooks and tapes meant safety. That if I held history steady, I'd anchor myself against madness. But anchoring failed here. Documentation gave shape, and shape made the storm stronger. Every recorded convergence became handprint evidence, but whose hands it served remained unclear. The house shook beneath wind. Electrical hum bled through walls as though the transformer outside caught resonance too. I stood at the window, chest pressed tight to glass, staring out as lightning revealed long ribbons of rain falling not chaotic, but regimented, striped like coated curtains. Each sheet a page flickered, each flash a sentence written across sky. It hit me then, worse than proof. Maybe these signals weren't built for us at all. Not communications gone stray. Not experiments slid loose. But transmissions made for some other receiver, some channel I could never imagine. And we, with our wires and our grief, were only bystanders writhing under waves never meant for human ears. The sense crushed me to knees. My brother standing outside in open storm, pulled not because it wanted him, but because he stood in a doorway never meant for him. The convergence peaked. Spectrum filled in brutal red blocks, ears ringing without sound. I slammed gear off, but the violation stayed, body tethered. I crawled backward from the desk, teeth clenched, breath sawing. My ally texted once more, "This isn't study anymore. It's escalation." Then nothing. Rain still pounded above, but all I could feel was the open door. Too wide now, too high voltage, too sharp to close. Proof no longer comfort. Proof became the fear itself. I curled beside the window, whispering his name again, wondering if even my whisper joined the convergence. Wondering if somewhere beyond thunder, something answered back unseen. I had carried the idea for nights. What if I stopped hiding behind walls and met it directly? The thought came reckless, born from exhaustion, grief, and the way convergence left me trembling at my desk. Proof had already warped into burden. My brother's absence no longer felt like mystery, but an open wound. So when the storm swelled again, tall and wide, I stepped outside. Rain fell in sheets that slapped skin raw. Cold water spilled down my spine, stinging eyes. I clutched my recorder to chest, red light blinking against darkness, and turned toward the sky like a supplicant. Wind tore hair across my face, but still I heard it low, rising, too deliberate to mistake now. The distortion surged, not carried by gust, but pressed through every drop. A vibration too clean. A rhythm too sharp. For minutes I stood, jaw slack, the sound not outside but inside. It filled lungs as though borrowed air carried intention. My thoughts tangled. Stray words formed at edge of tongue, not mine but seeded. Short fragments slipped out my lips unbidden, syllables I did not choose. No voice addressed me directly, yet my head swarmed, as if another presence pressed alongside. I staggered in mud, hand white-knuckled on recorder. The weight of invasion undeniable. The rain masked it, carried it, delivered it. Every drop colluding. I swayed under their endless chorus until dizziness overcame and fear scorched fresh. I stumbled back toward the door, body half numb, wheezing like I had walked a mile carrying stones. Inside, door slammed behind me, and still the hum clung. I stripped soaked clothes, kneeling by the gear shuddering, fighting bile at my throat. I dared lift the recorder again, shakily checking what it had saved. The tape scarred, warped, nearly broken. Playback carried distortion, bloated and cracked, whole minutes dissolving into unreadable hiss. Yet through collapse, in narrow seconds of rhythm, I swore I heard shape. Not full word, no voice. Just pacing resembling a name. His name. My brother's cadence, as if storm itself indexed it. I froze, mouth dry, listening a dozen times until certainty carved itself deep. He was in there, faint, echoed out of signal. Whether memory or actual trace I couldn't tell, and it frightened me more than any scream. I brought the scarred tape to my ally, desperate, near begging him to confirm. He listened once, wincing at distortion, then shook his head slow. Too damaged. That's not meaning, that's pattern seeking. His flat tone sliced. He didn't believe me. Not one fragment. I pushed, argued he had to hear what I heard. But he only grew colder, repeating that interference mutates. That grief carves hallucinations into random noise. His denial tasted like betrayal, but inside me I knew. Proof sins differently when it breaks you. I didn't confront an enemy that night, not in the way stories promise villains. The confrontation came against proof itself, against the weight that tore logic apart and buried certainty. Outside, the storm howled uncontested, shaking window frames, yet I only heard collapse echo, pulse trying to form into name. Alone again, I replayed scarred minutes until dawn spilled pale and gray. My body throbbed fevered, bones aching as if the storm had etched itself inside marrow. Each creak of roof felt co-conspirator. Each gutter hiss kept rhythm. And still I whispered back, throat raw, daring the hum to answer clear. Was it you who took him? Or was it always just door flung wider than either of us? The rain stopped by morning. Silence returned, carrying no comfort. Because the confrontation remained unresolved, suspended. Not with enemy, not with storm, but with fact pressed too close to deny. I had stepped into its body, let it inside my own. And proof had answered with the shape of my brother's name. Told myself there was still one thing left I could do. Collapse it all. Cut every thread, box the reels, ditch the notebooks that survived my last purge. Unplug the wires that had followed me like veins. I spent an afternoon dragging gear into husks of cardboard, sealing them with tape until the house looked less like a lab and more like a room abandoned. The desk sat bare, dust where circuits had rested, drawers emptied of cables. For the first time in months I heard nothing mechanical but the fridge hum in the kitchen. A silence so wide it felt forced. That night, I tried to sleep with window open, just a crack for air. Rain began late, soft, harmless. I rolled onto one side, lids heavy, and convinced myself it would pass without incident. But the hum came anyway, low as memory, not live, threading through dreams like wire pulled tight. I woke with sheets twisted around my legs, heart pounding as if I'd run. My first thought went cold. The recorder sat boxed in the hall closet. No feed was live. Yet my ears still rang. I fought down adrenaline, dragged myself to the desk, double-checked. Everything remained shut. Power cords severed. Battery packs drained. Nothing ran. And still, faint but certain, the spectrum meters on one device twitched. A single line rising on a screen I hadn't turned on. Like the gear itself was listening, even after burial. I unplugged that too, but unease clung bitter in gut. Intrusion no longer needed wires out the next day. My ally answered my shaken call with a sigh thick as old smoke. He said quietly, "You've let it inside too long." Exposure like that does more than distract. Resonance leaves marks that don't fade easy. His words sank cold into my chest, worse than denial. It carried finality, the way someone speaks about a sickness incurable. But what difference did warning make now? I had already stood outside in storm, already let vibration stamp deep against bone. He knew and I knew warnings were hollow, nights blurred. I stopped recording, but the hum threaded everywhere anyway. Taps against the window that once soothed now struck as marks, time hammered out with patience too exact. Even the radiator ticks beneath the wall seemed to join, pacing in rhythm, impossible cadence reasserted. I pressed palms to ears, but the body is not mute shelter. Once you've let pattern burrow, silence can't cling it free. I walked rooms restless, lights off, listening to phantom chorus peal from angles no wires touched. Memory joined with experience in ways that pried at sanity. Was it thunder I recalled, or thunder sown new into ear? Dreams bled into waking, each set with rain tempered by pulse. I began to stop trusting which house I walked in my present, or some archive running parallel. Each day I thought of stuffing the boxes deeper, burying them in landfill. But I knew truth sour in marrow. The tapes didn't matter anymore. History itself had been corrupted through contact. Information could spread without hardware now, in echoes stamped inside perception. I was conduit whether I wanted or not. By dawn, I often found myself pacing floorboards, whispering half prayers, half curses into stale air. Each radiator tick answered with same spacing, tightening loop, until my body shook with futility. I wasn't speaking to expel it anymore. I was acknowledging what it had become. Once you've heard, you become the archive. Ears turn to tape, skull becomes recorder, blood runs real. Trying to erase it only writes it deeper. I stood one night at the papered window, watching rain fall faint in streetlight halo, each drop like a hand drumming. My chest ached with one final truth. Breaking free wasn't resistance. It was impossible. Silence itself had joined them. And I had no road back. My ally stopped answering calls at first. I thought maybe illness, or fatigue, or the silence people retreat into when conversation turns too heavy. But then a single message arrived, short, clipped, final. Never send me anything more. His words struck harder than any distortion ever had. He had seen enough, or too much. Fear lived between the letters. He wanted no trace pinned to him. The quiet stretched thick, leaving me without anchor. Proof had isolated me the way storms blanket streets with floodwater impassable. Sequestered alone, that silence drove me to one last attempt. One final night to test whether the storm still housed that hum, whether it still breathed through gaps, whether I could prove, even to myself, I hadn't built mirage. The skies complied as if waiting. Clouds thickened across dusk and rain began sharp, stripping trees of leaves. I set the recorder down, not even taking notes this time, only staring at the blinking light, waiting for betrayal. Soon enough static found me, low, deep, right where storms normally kept it. But when playback rolled back, the strangest fracture tore through expectation. The first minute came whole, rain pouring, distant thunder layered deep. Then at once nothing. 2 minutes of vacuum, clean silence carved into tape as if the world itself had exhaled and forgotten to inhale again. No rain, no hiss. My porch outside had been drenched in storm, gutters roaring, yet here, on frontage of magnetic strip, blankness reigned. Between 1 second and the next, reality clipped. I rewound, certain I had mishandled reel, bumped switch. But the gap persisted. Sharp-edged, unbending, like an erasure already pressed into the medium. Time torn out, space gone. Every instinct rebuked the idea, yet my ears confirmed it, absence absolute. Inserted exactly where sound should roar the loudest. I stepped out onto the porch to prove memory. I closed eyes, listening to the torrent. Thunder curled tight above. The rain was real, constant. And still the tape insisted otherwise. My lungs burned. I realized the fracture was not machine's error. It was collapse. The same collapse I had charted in altered playbacks. The same mutation I told others, and they denied. Now logs bent reality itself, memory grinding against record. The world frayed to match the instability spreading in reels. My hands shook holding tape, feeling weight like ash. This wasn't distortion. This was subtraction. Grief tangled next, pressing fresh. My brother's vanishing no longer felt separate from this blank minute. Had his life been carved out exactly the same way time excised, erased, no longer archived by reality itself? Proof no longer sat in strange waves. Proof was vanishing itself. Consequence heavy as sodden soil fell on me. Because if storms can remove minutes, then whole lives fit neatly along that erasure line. The silence inside playback mocked me more than distortion ever had. Distortion still implies presence. This gap, this wound, shouted absence's function. I traced palms across deskwood, grounding myself against nausea. But mind-blurred grief of missing him, proof twisted blank, the consequence of years arching toward a single gap. I couldn't separate one from the other. Memory screeched into consequence, consequence fed back into grief, until nothing but collapse remained. I sat staring at recorder light, dimming during power fall, whispering into tape already hollow. No reply came, not tone, not chord, just the blank spool, and yet the blankness spoke volumes. It told me records can no longer be trusted tidy. That memory cannot be studied as archive. That storm itself is record, alive, shifting, rewriting with each drop. My work, my notebooks, my allies' cassettes, the declassified scraps, they were never the central archive. They were fragments of storm's mood only. I understood then, cold, final. Standing in storm writes you into its folds. It is not captured by you. You are captured by it. My brother wasn't a victim apart from history. He was written into weather the way trees become charcoal in lightning fire. And now I, through one gap of silence stretching fat across magnetic tape, had begun my inscription too. I played it again and again, praying for sound phantom back. Each iteration returned same void. Absence hardened into permanence. I slumped, eyes glassed, aware the storm outside still raged bright and fierce. Yet whatever lived within proof had rebranded itself as silence carved on real. The world was collapsing into its own unstable logs, and I with it. I sit now with more pages than I ever meant to fill. 20,000 words scrawled across ruined paper and lined into cold digital files. A body's worth of confession stretched through storms, every entry shaped by static and grief. I thought foolishly that sheer weight of proof might build closure. That tape stacked over tape would carve a path back to him, or at least to calm. But here at the end, the only thing I am sure of is how little ends at all. The rain still falls tonight, pale streaks against glass blurred by fatigue. I still press record even though my ally is gone, even though each tape feels less like salvation and more like surrender. I speak into the hum, not sure who it's for. Not me, not anymore. Maybe him. Maybe nobody. Maybe the storm alone, continuing its own archive with or without my interference. I let it run, red light blinking patient, and admit the truth to myself in a cracked whisper. Proof cannot heal. It cannot rewind into love or forward into certainty. Proof only reveals how deep the intrusion has always gone. I began listening for love. One desperate search for my brother's echo hidden in rainfall. I thought if I traced the hum down to its last root, I might pull his voice loose again. But now love has twisted into something unrecognizable. Was that faint curl of his name inside distortion a gift, or only my grief writing shape into noise? Have I resurrected him, or hollowed him further by amplifying absence and calling it presence? I don't know anymore. Each silence, each burst, each warped tape gave me new questions, but never resolution. My notebooks became mausoleums of shifting signals, but mausoleums only teach that the dead don't return. They linger, maybe, but in forms unfit for comfort. I have traded memory for noise that cannot confirm or deny what it devoured. The recorder hums by my desk. Storm rattles the gutters, thunder mutters like low beasts beyond view. I feel each vibration in bone. I wonder if the storm has written me already, if I too am inscribed into folds that can't be read by ordinary measure. Perhaps this entire testimony is nothing but one more offset spike inside its endless spectrum. Was I investigator, or was I raw material? The answer feels unnecessary now. The question feels ritual. Doors have been opened too long to ask whether I walked or was dragged through. They stand ajar at every rainfall, and each listener, each curious hand setting down a mic, widens them unknowingly. That is where this ends, with the doors still creaking wide. Not closure, only lingering. Not death, not rebirth, but reverberation. So I leave the recorder running. For me, for him, for whoever happens to hear. Maybe it will capture what I cannot. Maybe it will catch us both together at last, layered within distortions no silence can excise. Or maybe it will just save more absence, written steady atop void. Proof or grief, it makes no difference anymore. If doors open both ways, then what steps through defines the living, not the dead. That is what I understand at last. We cannot control what rain delivers, cannot shape the hum beyond what it chooses to become. But by listening long enough, by pressing record, despite the warnings, we are defined by what enters, what alters, what we no longer can turn aside. That is the risk and the cost of noticing. Thunder fades now, rolling away into distance. Yet in my ears the hum persists, steady, patient, unresolved. The door remains open, and I remain within its frame,